Good afternoon and welcome to the Game Design for Student Success webinar series. This is our eighth out of the 9-part series, and we will be discussing Dunbar clusters, and you'll find out what that means in just a second. As always, I'm Candace Best, your presenter for this webinar. And before we get into this afternoon's topics, I will quickly go over our housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and will be available through our broadcast page and on YouTube within about 30 minutes after the webinar concludes. As always, we invite you to encourage your colleagues to register. I know we're coming to the end of the series. However, registration will allow you to receive a link to the site where we will be uploading all of the prior webinars in the series in one package, and we'll also be including some additional resources that were not included at the time that the webinar went live to give you additional incentive to join us. So again, that's all information that will be shared to those who register and therefore get the link to the location of where the webinars will be held. So even though we're in the second to last webinar in the series, I would encourage you, if you have not already, to go to our website and register for this webinar and the entire series. We also would ask that you post any questions or comments that you have about the topic to the comment section on the broadcast page, not the comment section on YouTube. If you happen to be watching via YouTube, that's another reason to watch it from our site, because that is the persistent page where we will be responding to questions and comments after the webinar is over. So at any point when you are reviewing this or any of the other webinars in the series and are attempting to implement, hopefully, some of the practices that we discussed, you can always come back there and I will be able to respond to you and provide you with support through that location. Live tweeting is always encouraged using the hashtag GDSS. I also encourage you to give me a shout out. You can contact me directly via my Twitter handle, Candace Best, or our company Twitter handle at Learning Gateway. And finally, Brooklyn Bingo is our it's our little game that we play for those who are listening live. It only applies if you are listening live and you are registered listening through our broadcast page. If during the course of the webinar you hear a sign of Brooklyn, which would be a horn or a siren who come through the audio, and you type Brooklyn Bingo into the comment section, we will send you a $5 gift card. Again, that only applies if you're watching live to the webinar as it happens. So with that, let's move to our learning objectives for today. We have fewer learning objectives than usual because, as I will talk more about towards the end of this webinar, this is actually a two-part webinar in the sense that what we're covering today, the Dunbar clusters, as I call them, really connect everything that we've talked about up until this point on the previous webinars, particularly the Game Design for Student Success model and its emphasis on people and students. Is going to connect that to the final webinar in this series, Learn Nurturing, which will tie everything together. So we're going to just talk a little bit about what the Dunbar number, that actually should say number, not bar, excuse me. So explain what the Dunbar number is and what it signifies. Use the Dunbar model to identify key characteristics for student groupings. So we're going to apply the Dunbar model to education specifically, and then use that to start talking about strategies for incorporating what I call Dunbar clusters into the game design plans that we have been covering throughout this series. So first, I think it's obviously important to acknowledge where this comes from. The Dunbar number is named after British anthropologist Robin Dunbar. And the number is 150. So when you hear the term the Dunbar number, that's the number they're talking about. And it's referring to the cognitive limit that Robin Dunbar's research has shown is the limit of the number of people that we as humans can maintain stable social relationships with. So as an interesting side note, his background as a researcher actually started by researching primates. And he noticed, because they are social animals, that there was a limit to that being social animals, that there was a direct relationship to their brain span, that the more social you are, the more social relationships, let me restate that. By being more social, it actually it expands your brain band, and as a result, your cognitive capacity to handle multiple relationships also expands. However, that there's an upper limit. So we started by looking at what the upper limit was for primate social groupings, and that led him to be curious about whether the same applied to humans. He found that it did over multiple different tests, and what started out as a mathematical equation, actually, he was able to verify through both quantitative and qualitative methods. This has continued. He has continued to do this research and continued to publish it even through the age of social media, and found that even with social media, with accounts that we have on LinkedIn and Facebook that may say we have 500 friends or 5,000 friends, that this 150 number still holds true in terms of true stable social relationships. What's interesting, however, is that even though he has come to be known for what is called the Dunbar number, his research actually involves multiple numbers. And so I'm going to spend the time we have in this particular webinar going over all those numbers and applying them to education. But first, why? What should we apply them to education? The reason why I pulled this out as its own webinar relates directly to some key concepts that we've covered so far in the webinar series. One, we talked about, I believe in the last webinar, the 4 types of fun. One of the most important, one of the most impactful, I should say, types of fun was called people fun, right? So that in and of itself identifies that social relationships are an important part of successful game design. But we also know within higher education and our goals for higher education, that sense of a belonging is important. Within the game design for student success model, we have 2 particular elements in it that specifically are associated with people fun: first contact and onboarding. But in reality, all of the stages of the game design for student success progression arc model involve people, all of them. How individuals discover what it is you're introducing them to. There are many ways to do it, but research has told us that we are most likely to be introduced to something and actually want to follow through with it if it's introduced through other people. The interest in sticking with something difficult and our capacity to do that, our willingness to stick with it, is improved and enhanced if it's happening with other people. And serious fun, our experiences are made more meaningful when they happen with other people. And so again, although people fun is associated specifically with 2 stages in this model, the role of people, as I said in the beginning, the role of social relationships cannot be overstated and is an indispensable part of game design for student success, community building, and its role in designing any kind of intervention that you hope to improve outcomes for students. So with that as the backdrop, it makes sense for us to take a closer look at, well, what does that mean and how can we use that? And so the 6 numbers are reflected here. I've given them labels. So this Dunbar Clusters for Education are my labels, not Robin Dunbar's, that I've applied to these 6 groupings. So the number groupings come from his research. The labels are ones that I've applied. And so what we're going to go through now is one by one, I'm going to go through each and highlight how they relate to educational settings. And again, I'm focusing primarily on higher education here for the purpose of exploring how we can be strategic about taking advantage of what the characteristics are for these different levels of grouping. So let's start with what I call affiliates. That is 1,500 and above into infinity, the largest possible groupings. Where is their significance for that? Well, we can start with school affiliation, right? So all schools generally have a mascot. They have an identity that they try to advance as a part of their marketing. And if you think about the role of alumni, how people feel about being an alum of a particular school, all of that draws upon some shared identity associated with just going to the school. It also applies to the extent to which someone may want to go to a school. So in one of the podcasts that I did that I published with, and I've referred to before, Scott Renke, who is the coordinator for the Ball State Achievements app at Ball State University in Indiana. One of the things he talks about was he always knew he wanted to go to Ball State because that's where his grandfather went. He grew up in the town where Ball State is. All of that has to do with the power of an identity that schools have and that really successful schools leverage intentionally. Part of why that works is because it provides the context or a backdrop for establishing that first shared identity that you're inviting new potential students to be a part of. It helps with discovery of the school, and it becomes an entry point for what you hope as an institution will become deeper and deeper bonds with the institution, right? So that's our first level. It gives a school an advantage over any other type of experience that prospective students may be exploring, whether it's other schools or no school at all. The next level down are associates. So that's the number around 500. Now we're talking about large group characteristics. So what might that represent? Well, depending on the size of the school, it could be the major, it could be the class rank. So how many freshmen you have coming in. Class, whatever class you're part of, class of 2017, class of 2025. One way to think of it is that now we're moving from what I previously referred to as an external shared identity. That is the identity that you put forth that distinguishes you from people who don't go to that school. Well, now that students have enrolled and chosen to become a part of the school, well, now you need something to differentiate you from everyone else, because everyone's now that you're interacting, at least within your capacity as a student, is also sharing that identity. This is the beginning of starting to see what are ways that students start to individualize themselves, or at least associate themselves with others in ways that they can manage. Think again about the overarching point of the Dunbar number, which we'll get to next. And that is, what is the maximum capacity that we can maintain stable social relationships? What that's telling us is we are currently still above that number. So realistically, we are not expecting that at the associate level, students are forming meaningful relationships or bonds with other students that they may associate with because they live in the same dorm, if it's a large dorm, or because they share the same major. If 500 or more students have that major, it's something that they can identify as a source of commonality, but it's certainly at most going to be the starting point for establishing a relationship. It's not going to be sufficient for it because it's just too many people. But it's a start. Now we get, though, to that Dunbar number. So this is, the tipping point. This is where the maximum limit exists, which means there is this potential now for individuals who have this identity in common to actually form relationships. So what might that look like? That could be group affinity. So again, it could still be a major if this major is smaller. If you've attended a large university, think about that. Some majors are bigger than others. So the typical university, I think about my undergraduate experience, I was a business major. There were, I'm sure, thousands of business majors. So being a business major at St. John's University at the time I went, or probably now, wasn't necessarily going to be any more of an affinity than just being a member of that school or graduate of that school. Although students of the same major most majors, depending on the campus, the classes are held in the same building. So you did start to identify with the buildings where most of your classes were, right? So that may be both an associate and a connection level. But then within that, so let's say I'm a business is a big major. If it's a large enough school, maybe it's marketing or maybe it's accounting. If that starts to get small enough, once you start to get an identity that is small enough, that fits within that 150, that's when you start to, for the student, identify characteristics that you can remember. So if my school happens to have a lot of business majors, but only 150 accounting majors, or it has an art program. So, I'll tell another personal story. As it happens, my sister and I both went to the same university, but we didn't go at the same time. So I started after she graduated, but I was a business major. She was an art major. Her experience, as she recalls it, was much different by way of bonding than mine was, because her major was much smaller. She majored in commercial art. Everybody, the school was not known for commercial art. It had a very rigorous program while she was there, but it wasn't huge. So as a result, her recollection of her faculty, even to this day, all the years that she's been gone, the friends that she met, the experiences that she had, a lot of that was driven by their connection as being a part of this major that was not so large so that everyone knew it. That is powerful. If it's not the major, the question then for you is you're thinking about how this relates to the goals that you have, that you're thinking about gamifying, is at what stage do you fall? So is your program a program that has 150 students or less? You'll see as we move down, the smaller the group, the tighter the bonds that are potential. But if you are dealing with an identity, program, department, object, whatever it is, and you know that the number of students that you're touching exceeds 150, exceeds 200, let's say, because this number is also a range. It's not hard and fast. So it ranges anywhere from 100, 150 is the average, but 100 to 200. What we're saying is if you are focused on a program where let's say it's the freshman year experience, that's your responsibility, and you have 700 or 800 freshmen coming through, that class rank status is not going to be enough. Many schools have started by creating university colleges to make students, as a part of their freshman year experience, feel more a part of the school and ease the transition. But even then, so you're targeting, you're targeting that group. Let's say you're targeting freshmen. But if you have 500 or 600 or 700 freshmen, you will probably find that even that's a starting point. But then there are things you need to do within that to still have a meaningful effect on the experience of individual students. So it may be that within that focus on freshmen, you then break it up by major. Well, now we're starting to get into the 150, or you break it up by some other identifier. The point being, this is now giving you a good idea of where your first opportunities lie, and really being able to create anchors for students that are based on social emotional connections, which you really need to do, but this is what you're targeting. Again, so if the group that you're targeting is larger than 150, this is a number that you want to start trying to figure out, how do we get them down? How do we bring our groupings down to a number that can start to be manageable? From here, now we get smaller to 50 peers. Why is this significant? This is the level at which you can start to see friends. Friendships start to emerge, because the likelihood increases, not that a given student is going to really be friends with 50 people, but within a group of 50, you will be able to identify shared friends. So I know someone that someone else knows, and through that, I start to build connections. This is around the size that, depending on the size of the school, you have courses with this many students or clubs with this many students. It starts to take on the characteristics of a more intimate group. Again, it's still a lot of people. You're unlikely to invite that many people, to your home, but you would recognize whatever this peer group is, you would recognize them when you see them, because you would start to see them more frequently, and therefore their faces would become familiar. Maybe you might know their name or two, but you would at least be able to say visually that obviously you have something in common. And that starts to help build that familiarity that can provide the anchor for more meaningful relationships. And now we're starting to get to the level of friends, right? So friends are defined by, now these are a group of people that you would consider to be, as a student, part of your social circle. You'll start to have low risk disclosures exchanged between the parties. Low risk disclosures mean, now I actually do know your name. I probably know your major. Just through our interactions, I know where you're from, if we're from the same city, if we like the same things. This is now the size where it's possible for me to really know you as a friend. Whether we're close friends or not, this is where your close friends will potentially come from, because of the more regular interactions. Most importantly, that friend category forms the secondary support system for students. And then the last group is that number is 5. And these are the ones we call confidants, because you spend significant time together. This is a group of people where you will have meaningful personal disclosures, share private details of your life, concerns, worries. This is your primary support system. Now, let me pause here and say that the Dunbar number, that 150 number, is significant, but this number is also significant in Dunbar's research because he maintains that 5 is the limit of personal, intimate relationships that we can maintain, that's the upper limit. That in terms of your close friends, your close confidants, 5 is a number. He has researched this so much that he says, now, while this number is fluid, it's not going to be the same 5 people throughout your life. What he's saying is it will always be roughly 5 people. So, for instance, when you pick up a significant other into your life, then what that means is usually somebody on that 5 is going to get bounced out. They're going to be bounced out to more of the friendship category and not the confidant. We just can't maintain the intensity of relationships with more than 5 people. And that 5 people, those 5 people are going to include, so if we're talking about school, those 5 people may not all be classmates when we're talking about students because they may have really close friends from outside of school. It also may include family members. So there's not necessarily an expectation that a student is going to have all 4 5 other people that come from school. But the key here is that they should have at least 1. 5 is also a number that comes up in Dave Logan's work, and I will include a reference to that. In the comments section, he wrote the book Tribes, and the number 5 produces what they call 6 stable triads. So it's also significant because if you're talking about a work group, it creates a constellation of smaller groups that really, when they work well together, can produce great things. So this notion of the number of 5 confidants working together is really, really impactful. So here's why this matters. Students who don't make connections are probably going to be the first to leave. In other words, if you, as I mentioned, your students don't necessarily have to have all of their friends, their confidants, be people from their school. But if they don't have any confidants in school, if they're just coming to campus to take class and they're leaving and they don't have any close relations, then that means that the relationships that they do have outside of class are going to be a stronger draw away. Now, if they're extremely motivated and focused and committed, then they will proceed anyway. But if there's any kind of ambiguity, so now if we're talking about those students who are at highest risk for dropping out, first generation students, part-time students, students who have to work, more than 40 hours a week, if there are all these other demands, and on top of it, there's no social bond that is helping them when they get to a barrier, help them make the decision to stick with it and go through it, it just becomes that much easier to leave. So it's a huge mistake to overlook the importance of knowing whether or not students have made connections. And we did, at Learning Gateway, we did a survey, we did a study of a community college earlier this year, rural in upstate New York, and found one of the really surprising findings that we shared with the school was how many of those students did not have any bonds. They did not have any connections to anyone out within school, that they were going through their school experience and it was somewhat solitary. There's more of that going on, especially amongst the students that we know are at greatest risk and that we're trying to create interventions to keep. A lot of those students, you will find, if you scratch below the surface, do not have strong bonds. So what makes strong bonds? Well, social bonds get stronger as they get smaller. So if you are a large school, then the likelihood is greater that a student will float through and never make bonds because it's so easy to be anonymous. I say this as someone who was born and raised in New York, and I remember having a conversation with someone once about what's it like to be an introvert in New York. I'm a hardcore introvert. And someone was saying, oh, it must be horrible to be an introvert in New York because there's so many people. And the comment I made was, actually, New York is one of the easiest places to be an introvert because there's so many people that it's easy to be anonymous. It's much harder to be an introvert in a very small place where everybody knows your name because people are paying attention. In New York, it can be a very lonely place. I love my city, by the way. But the point is, if you are in a school, if your school is large, then you have a lot of students that are somehow floating around, and the likelihood is very great that they just don't have an anchor anywhere because they don't know anyone. So you want to think deliberately about how can you create situations, environments, experiences where there are opportunities for students to connect in more intimate ways. So these 4 categories should seem, if you watched our previous webinar in the series, these will look familiar. If not, I encourage you to do that. When we talk about how do you build community within a gaming system, there are 4 elements of it: proximity, commonality, social investment, and trust. We're really touching on that in the categories that I mentioned earlier. In terms of deliberate design, the first thing that you can do to try to create an environment or create situations where students can have the opportunity to create bonds is first put them together with other students that at least they're close enough or they're having regular interactions so that there is an opportunity for them to connect, and then provide them something that they have in common. So now, hopefully, you're starting to see why these Dunbar categories, I characterize them the way they did. We're talking about different reasons through a student's journey, different opportunities for them to see that they have something in common with other people at the school. It starts with, hey, you're now a Wildcat, you're now a Fighting Irish, you're now a Terrapin, or whatever your mascot is. You know, the minute you come in, you'll see students very, you know, one of the first things they want to do is go to the bookstore and buy a shirt that identifies them as part of the school. So students get that. But that's not going to be enough forever. That wears off as the stress and the reality of what it means to be a college student kicks in. So what you're trying to do is move them successively through experiences that allow them to see that they can create more meaningful beyonds at a deeper level than just what the school colors are. And so that leads us to where we're going to wrap up. So this particular webinar is going to be a little bit shorter than our webinars usually are in the series, in part because it's really part 1 of what will be our conclusion. I alluded to earlier, just a few minutes ago, why Dunbar clusters were important to game design and how you needed to approach them in terms of moving students in an experience so that they have this opportunity to create more and more meaningful bonds so that the experience on campus becomes more meaningful and therefore they're more likely to stick with it. What I'm really talking about is what we're going to talk about in the next and final webinar in this series, and that is something I call Learn Nurturing. We're going to talk specifically about how these clusters can be organized to create a funnel that pulls students in, why it would work from a theoretical standpoint, and how that fits into our overall game design approach that we've spent this entire series covering. So the next week's webinar will be not only our last and our wrap up and introducing this Learn Nurturing concept. We'll use the Learn Nurturing model to tie everything you learn together. And if you haven't already started thinking about how to put this together to accomplish the objectives that you have for your educational program, we absolutely will tie hopefully everything up in a bow for you so you'll know exactly how to do that. So we're going to end today's webinar much earlier, only because consider it, stay tuned, more to come. I hope you'll join us next week when we wrap up our entire series and this idea and tell you about what you can expect and how you can take this, what you've learned in this webinar series to the next level. Again, if you just joined us at the end, it's not too late to go and sign up for a subscription if you happen to come upon this webinar through an invitation from someone else. You can go to our website at learninggateway.com and sign up for this webinar series. And then you will be alerted to not only next week's webinar, but when we post all of the prior webinar links in one place with additional resources to support you in moving forward on your game design journey. So with that, I thank you for attending and look forward to seeing you in our next and final webinar in the series.